Hello everyone. Today we're going to be discussing Song for the Unraveling of the World by Brian Evenson. Somewhat similar to my Teatro Grotesco review, simply because they're both sort of dark collections of surreal stories. I found this, I'll just say first of all that I found this much easier to read and much more enjoyable than Ligotti's stuff. So so this is the last book that I read. I actually finished it last night. I find myself sort of more drawn to these. I go through cycles, and the start of the year was very much myth and fantasy aesthetics, classical stuff, The Broken Sword, Mabinogion, that sort of thing. I'm more interested in the sort of the darker sort of surreal aesthetic now. It's probably because I'm trying to get my novel project that I was working on didn't really come to fruition, and so I've started writing more short stories again, and I'm more interested in sort of blending reality and fantasy together with a lot of dark sort of imagery, sort of mysterious sort of thing. And so I usually like to read stuff that will inform my own writing, so I went for Song for the Unraveling of the World, a book that I had seen on Amazon quite a few times. I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to pick it up or not, but then I decided to just go with it. It definitely seemed like my sort of thing. I'll read the back to start off with. A newborn's absent face appears on the back of someone else's head. A filmmaker goes to gruesome lengths to achieve the silence he's after for his final scene, and a therapist begins impossibly to appear in a troubled patient's room late at night. In these stories of doubt, delusion, and paranoia, no belief, no claim to objectivity is immune to the distortions of human perception. Here, self-deception is a means of justifying our most inhuman impulses, whether we are aware of it or not. Pretty decent blurb, really. I'll say though that the first sentence is not accurate to one of the stories. A newborn's absent face appears on the back of someone else's head. That's a reference, obviously, to one of the stories in the book, actually the first story. And it's interesting because that's not actually what happens, or at least that's not the imagery that is portrayed in the story, from what I got anyway. Yeah, it doesn't quite add up to what's actually in the story, but it doesn't really matter. The book is definitely more. It's still dark and slightly unsettling, but it's not nearly as dark as Teatro Grotesco or anything like that. I found these stories, although they did get a little bit repetitive at the end, I found them quite addictive to read, just to see where he would go, really. Brian Evenson is a writer that I wasn't really aware of. He's not really in that circle of like Lovecraft, Poe, Ligotti, even Shirley Jackson. Actually, I would say Shirley Jackson has a lot more in common with Brian Evenson than the other authors that I mentioned, but I wasn't even. I guess he's more obscure, Brian Evenson, although he's quite well reputed and respected in his own little niche corner. But yeah, I'll just say though, one of the stories actually has a mention of a Lovecraft creature or god, Yog-Sothoth, which threw me back. It took me back a little bit. I was taken aback. It's in a sci-fi story, sort of Lovecraftian sci-fi story. But I just didn't think that he had any sort of connection to that sort of mythos, or even knew what Lovecraft stuff was. Because most of these stories are actually mundane, not mundane in that they're boring, but they're set in regular sort of suburban areas, cities, that sort of thing. Most of them anyway. However, one of the things I'll say is this book was a lot more varied than I thought it was going to be. A lot more varied, which is good. You'll go from a film director shooting a film in a house to a dystopian story set in a sort of wasteland with fantastical names, to sort of unexplained I guess sort of spaceship settings, sort of sci-fi spaceship settings. So it really does. It's quite a good mix. Although I have something to say about the sci-fi stories in a little bit. So I think what I'll do is I'll talk about the books. Sorry, I keep saying the books. The stories that I enjoyed, stories that I didn't enjoy, and maybe a couple that are just sort of halfway. To start off with the ones that I didn't enjoy, those would be stories like No Matter Which Way We Turned, which is the first one, the Cardiacs and Smear, stuff like that. Trigger warnings as well, a little bit. Those are stories that are either too short to really mean anything or too short to be impactful. I mean, I like stories to be more than about a page and a quarter or a page and a half for it to feel like I'm involved. For example, the Cardiacs was a strange, very it's almost like an interlude, which is fine, but I just can't imagine why the Cardiacs would be published in its own separate thing. Because to be honest, I didn't think it was that great. It's just a very, very quick short story about a stage performer who dips his hand into a chest. I think it's a chest. Sorry for the wind, by the way, it's quite windy. He dips his hand into a chest and he pulls it out, and there are these volunteers on the stage, and he pulls his hands out of this chest and they're all bloodied, and I think the idea is that he's sort of possibly taking their hearts out, I think, but he himself is unsure of what he's done, and he's shocked by his own performance, I think. And then he just sort of climbs into the chest slowly while the audience looks at the dead volunteers on the stage, and the performer just goes into the chest. I guess it's quite creepy now that I say it. It's somewhat creepy, but things like that, it's just they go and then they're over in about a second, that sort of thing. There are stories like Glasses, which just didn't really have much going for them. A story about, and sorry, I'm going to be spoiling these a little bit more. I figure I should try and discuss these stories a little bit more. Just thinking back to my Blackwood review, Algernon Blackwood review, I did go into the stories quite a lot, although admittedly there were novellas and there was only 4 of them. But yeah, I'll say for Glasses, this short story Glasses, it's about a woman who gets a new pair of glasses, and essentially a shop owner sells her what are called bifocals, and I think there's a little bit of humour there because usually they're bifocals. She's trying to get bifocals to improve her vision, and the shop owner sells her bifocals, and then she gets these sort of odd looking glasses with sort of reptilian scales on the lenses, which is quite a good image actually. Sort of like this biological baroque sort of design on the glasses itself, and she sees through into this other world where sort of shadowy forms are visible, I suppose. And that's sort of just a story. It's fine, good imagery, but it's just stuff like that just sort of go past you, and it's just like, okay, fair enough, I suppose. Another one as well. Actually, I'll talk about, whilst I'm here talking about the stories that didn't quite hit the mark for me, I think one of them as well that seems a bit out of place, although I did find some of it funny, is trigger warnings. And if you're aware of the term trigger warnings, you'll probably see what this is about in a second, if I can find it. It's a satirical story. Not a story actually, it's more just a little quick, again it's an interlude. So some of these ones are just a little bit too short. It's an attempt at humour in this somewhat dark and unsettling book. I'll just read the start. Caution, self-harming behaviour. Caution, depictions of war. Caution, depictions of self-harming behaviour in a war-torn nation, probably Serbia unless you are Serbian. Caution, severed head. Caution, self-severing of own head depicted in slow motion. Caution, unrealistic situation of violence such as is often depicted in manga. Caution, theatrical violence inflicted upon midgets. Caution, ghosts. Caution, flaming ghosts, as in ghosts on fire, not flamboyantly gay ghosts. Caution, gay ghosts. Caution, spiders. If you have a fear of spider phobia, talking to you, Debbie, you need help. You should stay the fuck away from this story. Caution, profanity. It goes on for a little bit longer, actually for about 2.5 pages long, just in that sort of style. Yeah, I did find it quite funny. It's sort of a piss take on trigger warnings and overly sensitive PC sort of culture, I suppose, which got a point to make. Although some of the reviews that I read about this particular story didn't find it as funny as I did, really. I think what I didn't like about it, though, I did find some of it funny, but I think it just felt a little bit too off. Again, I'm not really a fan of the irreverent sort of style, and I think that I just prefer my more sort of the stories that are earlier in the book. This felt like a little bit out of place. We can see just how varied this book is. Actually, I give this example of this short story, Trigger Warnings, to illustrate how varied it is. We've got sci-fi stories, dystopian, free filmmaking stories, little satirical story called Trigger Warnings. It's quite varied, definitely. Decent stories. In terms of decent stories, The Hole is quite interesting. It's about a man who goes missing down a hole in this sort of extraterrestrial landscape, this wasteland, and various people are trying to look for him, these astronauts, these explorers, and one of these explorers finds the man down the hole, and it turns out, and again these are spoilers, turns out that the man who's in the hole has been taken over by an organism, and it's almost like a babushka doll, if that's correct. There's different layers of identity, and a lot of these stories, I'll say, is a good point, a lot of these stories are focused on identity, and for example there'll be imagery to do with skin, layers, that sort of thing, fluidity, I suppose. And so this person who's down the hole is taken over by this organism, and uses the rescuer almost as a ladder to get out of the hole. And it's interesting because he starts off just in this hole, he takes over the person who's come to rescue him, and then he gets out to bring other people back. I should say, actually, he doesn't get out of the hole quite yet. He takes the rescuer to bring other people to the hole, and so essentially they all collapse into each other, essentially, and the person that's originally in the hole is allowed to come out, essentially, and comes out and wreaks havoc, assumedly. I think the story ends there. So there is a lot of these stories are definitely based more on ideas, so not really character-driven stories, at least not the non-mundane ones. The sci-fi ones, the dystopian ones, are very much more about ideas. Another decent story, not too great but not too bad either, apologies for the wind, is Wanderlust, a story about a more mundane story, relatively speaking, about a man who he's an office worker who feels that someone is watching him. Eventually leaves his life behind, his house behind, his wife behind, his job behind, and goes out wandering. Always needs to wander. He always feels this presence at the back of him. And eventually the story, again spoilers, the story comes round to where he actually re-enters his office building where the story starts, and he realises that he himself was looking at his younger self's back. It's quite an interesting image, and this idea that no matter how much he ends up in a mental asylum, institutionalized, and eventually gets out. And then the idea is that no matter how much he travels, he'll always have a younger self to look back on, I suppose. I think that was a message that I got from it. I really quite enjoyed that. That was a decent one. There are various stories that I did want to mention, but I risk sort of screwing up the structure of this review. There are a few bad ones that I did want to speak about, but I don't want to overrun the time or anything like that. I don't want to make this video too long. Try and cut down on the length sometimes. I'll say though, overall, that just to go back to the bad ones, we've covered some decent ones and we'll go to the good ones. I want to spend some more time on the good ones. But as for the bad ones, I felt like most of those were the sci-fi ones. Most of those were the ones that just weren't long enough to really be impactful. Sci-fi ones I had trouble with because I felt like, honestly, I don't think this author is a sci-fi writer. And I felt like they were a little bit too cliched. I felt like he was just trying on sci-fi. I can't really judge it too well enough since I'm not a sci-fi reader. I've never really been interested in sci-fi. But if I say, for example, that the story Smear is set on a ship, of course, a spaceship, and the character talks to the ship. And the ship is called the ship's recognition system is called Query, and he'll say, "Query, do this for me." I felt like that was a bit cliche. I mean, that's been done hundreds of times. It's just a standard thing in sci-fi, isn't it? Various sci-fi ones were like that. I felt like he was just sort of taking on the tropes of sci-fi. Just didn't really feel like it was his own voice. There's another sci-fi one called Lord of the Vats, VATS. Purely a Lovecraftian sort of story that didn't really go anywhere. That's the one with the Lovecraft Yog-Sothoth reference in it. It's about a Lovecraftian entity that sort of latches onto a ship, and there's a woman that is sort of the harbinger of this creature. And I won't really go into other than that. And it's just essentially she does some things that essentially make the ship return to Earth with this creature on it, and then we can extrapolate from there that the seed of this Lovecraftian creature will sort of proliferate across the Earth, that sort of thing. And there really was, most of the good stories are the ones that are subtle and have something to say, but I felt like that was just a standard sort of, it was Lovecraft in space basically, and there's nothing really to it. So again, that's why I would say that was one of the worst ones. But anyway, we've talked about some of the bad ones, some of the decent ones. I'd like to talk about some of the good ones now. I will start with the Room Tone, which is probably my favourite one, just because of how neat it was. Quite unsettling as well. It's about a filmmaker who's obsessed with recording room silence or ambience. I felt like it was a really neat story in terms of the structure. You really got the sense of the obsession of this filmmaker who, I'll say again, spoilers, he's leased or rented out a house just as the new owner is supposed to enter it, so he's really struggling to get his last bits of footage during this sort of intermediary period where the house owner is entering the house for the first time. And there's some conflict there with the house owner. He gets irate when he figures out what they're doing, and I'll say that he figures out that something is wrong with the film, and he realises it's the ambience. He didn't record the ambience in this particular room. It's really obsessive and quite small, and probably most people wouldn't notice it, but he notices it. And so he eventually, over weeks and months, he tries to get into this guy's house to record the room ambience. He could have just taken it from a stock sound file or whatever, but he tries to go into a specific house and to get the specific sound that he wants. And eventually, as you can probably imagine, the house owner finds out that he's broken into his house, and like the protagonist does everything he can to try and get the sound. He's beating up the house owner, but he just won't shut up. He actually says once he's less incapacitated, he says, "I'll make sure your piece of shit film never sees the light of day," that sort of thing. And in that, for the filmmaker, the director, that's the last straw. He insulted his art, so he kills him. And then he notices that the sound is just right in this room after he's killed him, and he just stands there recording it. And even after the tapes ran out, he just I'll actually read the last page. He began to move around the house, wiping doorknobs, removing his shoes, and smearing the bloody shoe prints into unrecognisability. He changed into a set of Mr. Mason's clothing and burned his own clothing on what he had to admit was a rather nice new Viking stove that Mr. Mason had installed. He obliterated whatever trace he could that he had been there. All the while he was doing it, he found something nagging at him, but he wasn't sure what. Only when he was close to leaving and was cleaning the blood off the boom mic in the kitchen did he realise what it was. He went back into the room, held himself still. Little had changed, and yet with Mr. Mason dead, the tone of the room was subtly different. He could hear it. Maybe he was the only one who could hear it, but he could. It was, he was almost certain, better. And so, standing there in his bloody socks, he turned on the recorder. It would be the thing that made the movie he felt. The awful weight of that silence, the way it smelled of blood. It would be not only good enough, but perfect, and only he would know why it was so. He stood there, perfectly still, holding the mic. Even after the reel had run out, he remained there, motionless, listening. It's a really good story. Really neat. That sense of obsession. Really good. Another really good one was Sisters. Quite comical, actually. It was really the only comical story apart from trigger warnings, but this was, of course, an actual story. Sisters is an interesting one about a family, a slightly odd family. We're not quite sure what they are. I sort of interpreted it to mean that there were ghosts or some sort of otherworldly presence or presences. They're trying to fit in to this sort of suburban neighbourhood, and on Halloween, I'll give you an idea here of what they're like. And then there's the one where we put on a face, not our own, and go from one door to the next and take things, but Mother had reached out and grabbed her arm. Where did you hear about this? I'll just say that there's a slight typo here. I, said Millie, which doesn't quite make sense. The immature specimens down the street. I was listening to them as they walked to the instructional centre, the school, as we can interpret there. They were talking about it. Did they see you? No, of course not, said Millie. I would never. And what did they say this day was called? Halloween, said Millie. Hallows Eve, Millie considered, shrugged. Maybe. Mother let go of her arm. Now that, said Mother, that's something we can celebrate. That's not their holiday, it's ours. Yeah, I found that quite funny. They're talking about all these different holidays that humans get up to celebrate. So the story is really about quite a fun story, not nearly as unsettling as the other ones. Stories about two sisters that go to a household to try and partake in Halloween, but sort of keep themselves hidden. So they enter one of these, not automatons, just one of those sort of machines that comes alive or blinks out lights or whatever when you get too close to it, or makes a noise, or says something. So they sort of enter it and sort of control the electronics, so that they're in control of it, obviously. They sort of stay hidden, and then during the night of Halloween, when the kids are trick-or-treating, one of the kids gets too close. It sort of looks too far into this sort of machine in which both the sisters are hiding in. And one of the sisters, I think the older one, or I think it might be the younger one actually, reacts poorly, let's just say that, and basically kills this kid by using the machine to reach out and I think strangle. So one of the things though that I read a review that the story just ends one sentence too long. The idea is that this kid that's died then comes to the family, and that's how, for example, and that was how our family grew from 4 to 5, and I came to have a new sister. Millie did not seem excited, but I most certainly was. A new sister, I thought, imagining all I would be able to teach her, a new sister. And teach her I did, and loved her too for the whole remainder of the evening. But then there's the very last sentence, which I won't spoil, completely goes against everything that, I quite like the idea of she's now dead, and she sort of enters this household, and she's one of them. But then it completely just goes against what the author has just said in the very last sentence, which I won't spoil. can be disappointed for yourself. Yeah, so that was a good story. It was fun. It's just a kind of a whimsical sort of story, but the ending really just didn't hit the mark at all. So I think there's really quite a few stories in here to discuss. I don't want the review to run on too long. Some I really quite enjoyed. Suffice it to say, the stories are really quite varied. Some of them don't really hit the mark. Some of them definitely do. It's one of those ones. It's not got quite the same drastic change from terrible to great that Ligotti does. They're more sort of even. I'd say definitely pick it up if you're interested in sort of surreal stories that deal with paranoia, obsession, identity. I think some of them are a little bit too straightforward, and also some of them as well, though, however, I feel like some of the elements didn't really quite connect. Or maybe I'm just not smart enough to, or maybe they're not meant to be understood. Because I will admit I like surreal stories, but I also like more sort of concreteness in my plots and structures. It's something to latch on to. I just found that some of these stories ended with a feeling of, so what exactly was he trying to say, or what was I supposed to get from that? How does this element really connect with that element? What is the symbolism there? So I definitely recommend the book. I probably will read another collection. I think I might read A Collapse of Horses, or I think it's the Last Days. Either way, Brian Evenson does have quite a few collections out there. I think he even wrote some novels as well. Yeah, I'll definitely recommend Song for the Unraveling of the World. So I might return after this. I might return to some more classic fantasy, maybe Mythago Wood, or try and tackle the Riddlemaster trilogy by Patricia McKillop. So see where it goes. So thanks for watching, everyone. Till next time.